Tamriel is a melting pot of many different cultures and species. Over its long history, it has seen many wars, waged in many different ways. The diverse nature of all the races of men, mer, and beast folk, together with the presence of magic in the world, open up exciting new military strategies. So today, we will take a deeper look at the strategy employed by the Khajiit against the Bosmer during a conflict known as the 5-Year War. Yes, this is a really random topic to talk about, but I couldn't be more excited to do so. Without further ado, get ready for some Elder Scrolls lore. So this is the second episode of my new series, which I'm calling Tamrielic Apocrypha. Maybe we will come up with a better name now down the line, but I kind of like this one. And this is a series of mostly audio experiences with very little visuals, where I talk about Elder Scrolls lore, and each episode will be based around a specific lore book or series of lore books. The first episode, if you haven't seen it, was about the first pocket guide to the Empire, which is really this seminal work which laid the groundwork for modern Tamriel as we know it. But today we're looking at the very random topic of Khajiit military strategy through the lens of Mixed Unit Tactics, a book series. Hang on, did I say series? That's right, if you've played Morrowind, Oblivion, or Skyrim, then you've only ever really seen Volume 1 of this book. It first appeared in Morrowind as Mixed Unit Tactics Volume 1, and I think the number was even dropped for either Oblivion or Skyrim, so Bethesda essentially stopped implying that this is a series. But there is actually more than one volume written of this book, and most of the sequels have actually been written by the original author of the book. The author of the first book is Douglas Goodall, a developer who became involved at Bethesda during the time of Morrowind and was heavily involved in the production of that game. Sometime after Morrowind, I believe, he left Bethesda and has never really been involved in any official capacity, but to this day he still keeps making mods for Morrowind. His latest mod release is from February 2025, so just a little over a year ago at the time of recording this, so he is still very actively involved in the community. And as part of one of his mods, he wrote 3 sequels to the Mixed Unit Tactics book. So even though this series as a whole is not technically canon, it's as close as it gets because it has the blessing of one of the original developers. Now, he wrote Mixed Unit Tactics Volumes 1, 3, 4, and 5. But as for Volume 2, that one was actually written by a developer of Tamriel Rebuilt, which, in case you don't know, is this massive project to bring the rest of Tamriel into the Elder Scrolls 3. It's what I usually cover here on the channel. It's my main topic. It's my favorite topic, actually. But yeah, one of the developers of this mod, someone called Infragris, wrote a second book in the series, and when Douglas Goodall saw it, he liked it a lot, so he decided that his own 3 new entries would be labeled from Volume 3 onward. So now we've got this exciting 5-part book series about Khajiit military strategy to go through. Now, in lore, it was written by Codus Colonus, which is actually an interesting name as well, because this is someone we can meet in Morrowind. He owns a bookstore in Aldran, so you might actually be familiar with his name. He, apart from being a bookseller, he also is a veteran of the Legion. Codus Colonus was stationed at Fort Sphinxmoth during the 5 Years' War, so he really had first-hand experience, and even later on he spoke with both sides, so he's as good of a source as we're going to get. So, for our case study of Khajiit military strategy, it's good to start by explaining the point of the 5 Years' War, or like what was this conflict? Now, depending which side of the conflict you ask, the war started either in 394 or 395 of the Third Era and ended in 399. For a large part of this war, Valenwood was at a disadvantage because they also had to fight their neighbors to the west, Somerset Isle. Because of this, I don't feel like I have a reason to make a big secret of the fact that Valenwood ended up losing both those wars. And specifically the 5 Years' War ended with Elsewhere taking both banks of the Xylo River, which ultimately doesn't seem to be that significant of a piece of land. Okay, that's enough intro stuff, now let's get into Mixed Unit Tactics Volume 1. Codus Colonus begins by explaining that the war started with the slaughter of Torval in 395 of the Third Era. Torval is, of course, an important city for the Khajiit, the home of the Khajiit Main, which is this spiritual leader, spiritual authority for the species. And the Khajiit would tell you that this was an unprovoked invasion from the Bosmer. The Bosmer just rolled up into town for no reason, killed over 1,000 citizens, and would have probably killed just about everybody if reinforcements from a nearby jungle tribe hadn't arrived to drive them off. The Bosmer version of the events is a bit different. They are saying that this slaughter was actually retaliation for Khajiit bandits ambushing wood caravans going to Valenwood. This, of course, refers to the fact that the Bosmer don't cut down trees of their own, and so they have to import wood if they want to make any wooden products at all. So Khajiit bandits ambushing these caravans would probably have been an economical disaster for Valenwood. Our writer was not present here, and as we will see, we will not really get a full picture of this conflict as a whole. Rather, we will hear a lot about the events which Codex Calonus was actually a part of, and I will try to fill in some remaining data from other sources, but there is still a lot of space to be expanded upon in the future if Bethesda or anyone else would choose to do so. As I said, Codex Calonus was stationed at Fort Sphinxmoth. This is an imperial fort close to the city of Dune, next to the Xylo River, which is basically the border between Elsewhere and Valenwood. By the way, if you're just listening, I'm showing right now on screen a map of the provinces of Valenwood and Elsewhere as portrayed in Project Tamriel, which is obviously not an official Bethesda project, but I think this map will be really helpful even if you're not following Project Tamriel, because these maps are made specifically with Morrowind-era lore in mind. So, because of the proximity of Fort Sphinxmoth to the border, Codex Calonus was able to witness some of the conflicts that took place here. His first account is from spring 396, when war moved closer to the fort. The Khajiit used quite unconventional tactics, to say the least. They would cut down trees on the outskirts of Valenwood. This was done by the Cathairat and Sencheirat forms of Khajiit, and I will have to explain the forms of Khajiit here in case you're not familiar with them. So, not all Khajiit are the same. There are various types of Khajiit, depending on the phases of the moons at the time of the Khajiit's birth, and they can look just vastly different. For example, Codex Calonus describes Cathairat, sometimes called Jaguar men, who are one of the largest forms. They walk on two legs, which might not seem that strange if you've only played the games. But the other type that Codex explains here are the Sencheirat, called the Battle Cats, and these walk on all four. They are these almost panther-like, or yeah, panther is probably the best description, I think, panther-like creatures. Now, they actually carried large wooden shields on their backs into this battle, which will become relevant later on. Why did the Khajiit cut down trees on the outskirts of Valenwood? Well, as I mentioned, for Bosmer, cutting down the trees of Valenwood is a crime. So this was a Khajiit strategy to draw them out. And it seems to have worked. The Bosmer sent some of their archers there, which weakened their southern forces. At this time, there were important battles taking place in the south, so by splitting their army this way, the Bosmer weakened their southern forces. These Bosmer archers settled in the branches, and they managed to shoot down the first few Khajiit. The Khajiit reacted by building shelters from the large shields which the Sencheirat had carried to the battle on their backs. They essentially built like this turtle bunker from their shields, and they refused to leave. These shields were apparently big enough to hide even the huge Sencheirat. And the Bosmer tried to wait them out, but the Khajiit were more patient, and finally the Bosmer archers were forced to descend from their trees. They had to engage the Khajiit in melee combat, which was, of course, not as advantageous for them. It turns out that all of this was a big trick, because when the Bosmer came close, one of the Khajiit gave signal by playing a native instrument of plucked metal bars, and on this signal, suddenly several Ohms and Ohmsrat came out of covered holes in the forest floor. Who are the Ohms and Ohmsrat? These are two Khajiiti forms which look very similar to either men or mer, depending on who you speak to. The Imperial Geographical Society in the first pocket guide tells us that they often serve as diplomats, but as we can see, they can also be effective infiltrators. And effective they were, despite their small numbers. They managed to take the Bosmer by surprise, attacking them from behind. But not all of the Bosmer archers had descended, and the ones in the trees still posed a significant threat. Fortunately, for the Khajiit, they still had one more trick up their sleeves. Quote, the Bosmer archers in the trees would have still won the battle were they not having troubles of their own. A group of Degi and Degirat, two of the less common forms of Khajiit who live in the trees of the Tenmar forest, jumped from one tree to another under a magical cover of silence. They took up positions in the higher branches that could not hold the Bosmer's weight. When the signal came, they used their claws and either torches or spells of fire, accounts from the two survivors I spoke with vary on this point, to distract the archers while the battle on the ground took place. A few of the archers were able to flee, but most were killed. End quote. The Degi and Degirat are two Khajiit forms who are clearly excellent tree climbers because of their origins from the Tenmar forest, which is this large forest in the central southern region of elsewhere. But they are not exactly known for their proficiency at magic, at least not as far as I remember. The magical cover of silence was actually provided by few Alfiq among them, and Alfiq are this cute type of Khajiit. They basically look like house cats, but they are dangerous. They have an extraordinary magical talent. Now, Codus really mentions these as a joke. He dismisses their existence, saying that he heard these rumors from some of the fighters, but he finds them hard to believe. But of course, as students of Elder Scrolls lore, we know that the Alfiq are very real. Anyway, the Khajiit managed to obliterate an entire company of archers this way, while taking very few losses. The Bosmer reacted by sending another company of archers to do essentially the same thing, the same strategy, and unsurprisingly, the results were pretty much the same as well. Since the first volume of the series ends here, I think this is a great place to sort of summarize what we've learned so far. The Khajiit used their knowledge of enemy weaknesses, these weaknesses being their religious code, which prohibits them from cutting down trees, and also their weakness at melee combat, which might not be exactly a weakness, but it's definitely not as big of a strength as their proficiency at archery. The Khajiit also managed to use their various forms very effectively, each playing to their strengths. The Bosmer lost this part of the conflict because they underestimated the Khajiit. They underestimated them because the Khajiit are known as desert dwellers, Elsewhere is known primarily as a desert province, and the Bosmer are at home in the forest, so of course they didn't consider the fact that someone might get the better of them in their homeland. But of course, they forgot that the Degi and the Degirat are at home in the Tenmar forest, and the ignorance of this fact ultimately led to the downfall of the Bosmer, at least at this point in the conflict. The second volume of the series picks up directly where the first one left off. The Bosmer who survived this second battle ran to the southern forces, which were stationed around Torval, and told of what had happened. And this time the Bosmer didn't make the same mistake again. They didn't send another company of archers. Instead, they dispatched a large army, including some Bosmer mages. The way in which they traveled was also more strategic. Quote, not even the Bosmer are capable of remaining unseen while marching in large numbers. They can, however, mask the true size of their force. By marching in single file, controlling lines of sight, and through select chameleon and silence spells, the Bosmer made it appear as if a much smaller group was underway, similar to the previous two. End quote. This time it was the Bosmer who would trick the Khajiit. When they arrived, they took up basically the same positions as before, and the Khajiit, of course, attempted to use the same tactics yet again. Wait for them to descend, sound the signal, make the Degi ambush them from above, etc. However, Bosmer this time used shamanic invocations and traditional hunter tactics to send local beasts toward the Khajiit. Being at home in the Valenwood, they knew how to manipulate the local animals to help them in the conflict. Remember those Khajiit firecasters in the trees? Yeah, they got swarmed by birds. What about those underground warriors? Well, they were driven out by spiny, burrowing creatures. And the main force hidden behind wooden shields apparently got stampeded by a local herd animal. Now, the Khajiit obviously did not expect this, and they retreated quite chaotically in panic, which made them perfect targets for the Bosmer archers. Still, the Khajiit managed to recover from this fairly quickly and switched to a more methodical retreat. What they would do is they would destroy saplings and trees with axes, which once again riled up the Bosmer, who then began to pursue them. The Khajiit also traveled at a slower speed than they needed to. They essentially wanted to look decimated, and obviously the rested Bosmer moved at a much faster pace than them, so they were catching up to them quite quickly. But this was all a feint. When the Bosmer got close enough to shoot them with arrows, the Khajiit immediately picked up pace, giving away land which wasn't that strategically important, hoping to distract the enemy from the conflicts in the south. They managed to do this quite well. The Bosmer apparently kept pursuing the Khajiit north for several days. They ran after them past lookout points around Fort Sphinxmoth, along the Xylo River, and at one point, when they had almost cornered them, a bird flew in with a message. The message told them that in the south, a large force of Khajiit had broken through, threatening the town of Haven. So the Bosmer were forced to immediately stop pursuing the Khajiit and travel south. Now, obviously, as we can see, the main problem of the Bosmer in this part of the conflict was that they lost sight of the big picture. They let themselves be goaded. But the more interesting part of this is, how exactly did the Khajiit in the south know when to attack? Codus Calonus tells us this, quote, I am unsure of how exactly the Khajiit coordinated these skirmish attacks, though I have heard some Khajiit allude to a secret method of long-distance communication using moon sugar trances. I would dismiss this as obvious make-believe in the vein of the Alfiq, were it not for similar meditative communication systems used by the Emperor's own clerks. End quote. This is very interesting. I don't think I've heard anything about moon sugar being able to help you communicate telepathically with other Khajiit before. If there are any sources talking about this, whether they be official or from Tamriel Rebuild, let me know. But yeah, the key takeaway from this book of the series is that the small Khajiit force managed to distract the larger Bosmer army, and in this way they secured key positions along the Xylo, which would become very important later. Now at this point, let's take a break from mixed unit tactics and let me bring in another source, Cherim's Heart of Anequina. Volume 18 in the book series Interviews with Tapestrists. Now, this is, as far as I know, this is the only volume which has actually been written. I would very much love to see other volumes of this book because this one was pretty interesting to me. This is essentially an interview with a Khajiit tapestry weaver who also fought in the war and created a tapestry depicting one of the most important battles of the war, the Heart of Anequina. This book essentially describes the author's interview with this Khajiit, this Khajiiti man called Cherim, and is a pretty fun short read, but for our purposes we will stick just to the military info contained in it. Cherim tells us that at some point there was a Battle of Zelinin. If you look at the map, it seems to be a smaller settlement further south along the river. In this battle, the Khajiit took the advice of their Nordic allies and decided to use plate mail, and as you can imagine, it was a disaster. Khajiit are not used to heavy armor like that. They felt way too hot in it, it was way too heavy for them to move. They could barely see their fellows, as Cherim describes, and so they lost the battle. But during the big, decisive, important battle, the Heart of Anequina, which, by the way, Anequina is the name for the northern region of Elsewhere, in which most of these battles were taking place. I probably should have mentioned that sooner. Well, at this point, they had already sent their Nordic advisors to Solitude and used their traditional armor, which was way easier for them to move in. Cherim tells us this, quote, It seems strange to say, but one of the best features of traditional armor is that an arrow will either deflect completely or pass all the way through. An arrowhead is like a hook, made to stick where it strikes if it doesn't pass through. A soldier in traditional armor will find himself with a hole in his body and a bolt on the other side. Our healers can fix such a wound easily if it isn't fatal. But if the arrow still remains in the armor, as it does with heavier armor, the wound will be reopened every time the fellow moves. Unless the Khajiit strips off the armor and pulls out the arrow, which is what we had to do at the Battle of Zelenin. A difficult and time-consuming process in the heat of battle, to say the least. End quote. Unfortunately, as far as I know, we don't have any idea when exactly these two battles, the Battle of Zelenin and the Heart of Anequina, took place, or how they fit into the wider conflict. So we have to be content with this information and continue with the Mixed Unit Tactics series, this time Volume 3. To start with, it's important to explain that the Bosmer Khajiit border was marked by fighting since even before the Third Era. It's quite a unique stretch of land as far as biomes go. You've got the desert, which quickly transitions into a grassland, and then to a forest of all things. And this is most likely caused by the constant cutting and replanting of trees. Listen to how Kodos explains this border dispute. Quote, "This is how the unofficial border between Elsewhere and Valenwood is marked. The Khajiit cut down the trees, the Bosmer replant them, the Khajiit dig tunnels to undermine them, the Bosmer flood the tunnels to kill the Khajiit and make the desert bloom, and so on for centuries. I asked Jaduzar, the only Khajiit I trusted and a fellow legionnaire, about this the next day. At first he just repeated the common saying in Elsewhere that wide deserts make good neighbors. Eventually he said, and I believe I wrote this down exactly even if it makes little sense, do not weep for trees. Valenwood is a shola, a kind of sand-burrowing crab. The trees are the fingers of Ifrei who stretches, then grasps. If the forest grows too wide, it is another moon dance of suffering. The Shaper could finish her sculptures, and Jaduzar is clever enough already, don't you think?" End quote. Well, I'm not quite sure why I included the last sentence. Perhaps it's that I don't understand it at all, and I'm hoping that you, dear listeners, can help me make some sense of it. So, the Dune battlefield was primarily the long stretch of grassland between the desert and forest. The first year of fighting was basically this sort of chaotic back and forth, but then the Khajiit managed to take hold of the land for long months. They managed to take their tree-cutting efforts further into Bosmer territory than they had ever achieved before. The trees that they cut down would then get carried by the large Sencherat into the Khajiit city of Dune. I'm saying this because this will become relevant later. Ultimately, at some point, both sides of the war moved the bulk of their forces south. When the Bosmer army started to move, the Khajiit stopped attacking and instead set up a few defensive and scouting forces, which were supported by the Dune garrison. It seemed that the situation in the north would calm down, but then the Bosmer suddenly attacked and managed to take all of those defensive camps. Quote, "The Khajiit sent scouts into the forest regularly, but even so the Khajiiti camp was taken by surprise. I heard rumors later that the Bosmer caught the scouts, flayed them alive, wore their skins, and with the aid of illusions, fooled the Khajiit into thinking the scouts continued patrolling and reporting. I heard also that the Bosmer led scouts into ambushes and used forbidden arts to reanimate them long enough to make a report. Either way, this proves beyond any doubt that the Empire must continue its effort to civilize the Bosmer." End quote. Now, you might be thinking, well, why did the Imperial soldiers simply watch all this brutality and do nothing? The garrison at Fort Sphinxmoth had been commanded to not leave the fort. They were only supposed to get involved in the war if one of the sides actually attacked the fort itself. It turned out that these were the commands of the usurper of the Imperial throne, Jaeger Tharn. These orders were given during the Imperial simulacrum. So Kodos Kalonos had to witness atrocities such as this. Quote, "Neither the legions nor the Khajiit expected hundreds of naked Bosmer to run screaming out of the trees, covered with symbols drawn in blood, and followed by a howling menagerie of every wicked forest beast. The battle took place too far from the fort to see without a spyglass, and the dim light of a gibbous masser was not enough to make out the full battle, but the unholy racket woke the whole fort. We stood on alert, sharing a half-dozen spyglasses, and tried to follow the battle as best we could. I am no expert on Valenwood's fauna, and the view, as I said, was very poor, but we all agreed there were beasts out there unlike anything we had seen. The Bosmer attack looked wild and unplanned, but they used clever, if strange and dishonorable, tactics. End quote. Now, to me, this kind of sounds like the Wild Hunt, but I'm not 100% convinced. The Wild Hunt is described as this bunch of shape-shifting beasts, and I feel like this could be explained by the Bosmer savagery without resorting to uh, this almost mythical, almost supernatural force. But let me know what you think about that in the comments. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts here. Regardless, the attack was well coordinated because while these savage Bosmer with those beasts went into melee with the Khajiit, Bosmer archers and wizards would climb nearby trees and attack from range. Now, the blood-painted Bosmer in the melee actually had these sort of strange enchantments, and when they died, these symbols lit up, which basically showed the archers all the surrounding Khajiit. The wizards had also enchanted their arrows to burn or explode, which in turn made the beasts fight even more savagely, so this was an absolute slaughter. Overnight, Dune was completely destroyed. By dawn, they had surrounded, and no Khajiit outside of the city had survived. The Bosmer then held a great celebration and feast. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this in this podcast already, but the Bosmer have this doctrine, this tradition known as the meat mandate, which compels them to eat the bodies of their fallen enemies within 3 days, as we read about in the first pocket guide. When it comes to the Khajiit, they are actually considered a delicacy among the Bosmer. They are rich in fat and sweetness, presumably because of all the sweet food and, sweets that they consume. After this great feast, the Bosmer spent the next few weeks constructing siege equipment. They were actually building this equipment from wood, believe it or not, because these were the trees felled by the Khajiit, so the Bosmer didn't really break their vows by using wood in this way. Now, of course, the Khajiit could not leave this brutality unpunished, and they came up with a pretty devious trick. What happened is, suddenly a bunch of Khajiit that had been hidden in the desert just ran out. They just sprinted mindlessly at the Bosmer to be slaughtered. And slaughtered they were, of course. Now, the Bosmer immediately cooked and ate them, as you do, but this time that had been a tremendous mistake. Many of the Bosmer died overnight, which weakened their force greatly. You see, the Khajiit had actually drank a slow-acting poison before running at the Bosmer, so they had essentially sacrificed their lives to destroy a substantial portion of the enemy force in this way. So, that was the third volume of the Mixed Unit Tactics series, and this one was all about the most brutal, the most devious tricks that both sides of the war had been able to come up with. Now, Volume 4 picks right back up with the Siege of Dune. Both sides were now weakened, which meant that the only fighting that was going on at this point were really just minor skirmishes, mostly insignificant. At one point, though, the Bosmer had finally finished their siege engines. Quote, "It seemed the city of Dune was defenseless and would fall within the week, or perhaps even by that evening. The Bosmer engines were huge and imposing, much larger than those used by the Empire, and they appeared capable of throwing boulders weighing 500 pounds or more. As much as the Bosmer claim to preserve trees, many of them are masters of carpentry and related crafts." End quote. Now, this last sentence is very interesting because it says essentially the opposite from what the Pocket Guide to the Empire first volume tells us. If you had listened to that episode of mine, or maybe you've just read the Pocket Guide on your own, it says there that the Bosmer are fascinated by carpentry and wood products precisely because they are prohibited from felling trees and using them in this way. Well, be that as it may, the Bosmer also had another advantage in the form of the Imga, who, although they were not really traditionally fond of the Bosmer, decided to help them after the Khajiit had attacked one of their camps. So, it sounds like the defenders of Dune were quite outnumbered this time around. Now, their defense began quite well when they managed to set one of the trebuchets on fire, but the other trebuchets would then quickly breach the western wall, and the Bosmer launched their attack. Still, the Khajiit had planned their defense quite well. After the walls were breached, the big Cathairat and Suthairat immediately ran to defend them. Now, these are among the slower Khajiit forms, so it would follow that they were easy targets, and indeed they did suffer heavy losses during this attack, but they managed to keep the Bosmer out for the time required. And at one point, suddenly the gates of Dune, which were located in the north and south of the city, opened. Khajiit ran out of the city and attacked the attackers who had breached the western wall from both sides. Now, most of the Khajiit defending the city were non-combatants. Remember that the bulk of the forces had gone south, but they used quite clever tactics yet again. Quote, the first were Senche Rat in harness, pulling carts with small onagers manned by the smaller Khajiit. By the way, onager is a kind of tiny catapult. I had to look that up. I'm not a native speaker and all that. Anyway, continuing with the quote. Each cart had two onagers cleverly mounted on some kind of pivot so that one could be wound while the other was aiming and firing. The pivot let them fire in all directions except directly in front or back. They threw fire pots in great quantity, but with little accuracy at range. However, their maneuverability allowed them to approach a siege engine or mass of Bosmer, fire a few shots, and flee before the Bosmer could retaliate. End quote. Now, these Khajiit quote-unquote units included archers and wizards, including the magically inclined Alfiq. And this is a very interesting moment in the text, because if you remember, in Volume 1, Codus Calonus explicitly rejected the possibility that Alfiq could be real, and now he's just casually mentioning them because he saw them with their own eyes. Well, I was very surprised by this, especially considering that both those volumes were written by Douglas Goodall, even if, 20 years had passed since the writing of Volume 1 and the rest of them, but I decided to reach out to him and ask him what he meant here. Douglas Goodall, one of the developers of Morrowind, is present in the Tamriel Rebuild Discord, so I decided to ping him and ask him what he meant by this, and he replied very succinctly and matter-of-factly, "My bad," suggesting that, yeah, he done goofed up, he just forgot about this tiny detail. Which, is understandable. After 20 years, it happens. But as someone who treats these texts way too seriously, as if they had actually happened, I can't take this for an answer. So I have to come up with some convoluted theory about how Codus Calonus is losing his memory and how he doesn't remember what he wrote last week or month or whatever, and how he's a super unreliable narrator, and how there is actually no point to reading these books at all because Codus has no idea what he's talking about. But these books are still really fun, so let's just keep going as if this didn't happen, okay? So, these archers and wizards, including the Alfiq, were mounted on Senche and Pamarat. Pamarat is a form which I don't believe we've mentioned yet. They are quite similar to Senche tigers, but they are even larger and even more dangerous, apparently. Now, the strategy of these units was to charge into range, fire off a few arrows or spells, and then quickly retreat, and basically just repeat this process for as long as necessary. Other Khajiit also formed ground units. These were mostly smaller, man-like Khajiit armed with sling spears. They would sling stones at the Bosmer to distract them from fighting, then flee or charge with their spears, and in this way they would essentially pin the Bosmer between two Khajiit forces from two sides, which worked wonders. Now, despite the fact that these individual units were weak and composed of non-combatants, working together in this way proved very effective for them. You could say that they had mastered mixed unit tactics. Listen to what Codus says here, quote, "The legions fight in large formations wherever possible, and I fear the Khajiiti tactics here might be effective against an unprepared legion. The legions are trained to use the dreg or mudcrab formations, where we can defend from attacks on all sides, but the firepots and hit-and-run tactics might still disrupt a legion cohort. The Bosmer had greater numbers, siege engines, and their famous archers, but they did not have the training or equipment to form up into something like the mudcrab, and they were routed." End quote. So Codus is actually suggesting that the Khajiiti tactics might be a weakness for the Imperial legions, and he also tells us that despite the fact that he keeps urging his superiors to train the legion soldiers in fighting against this kind of strategy, the legions still haven't learned to defend themselves well against smaller, more mobile units. Now, this whole battle sounds pretty chaotic, but what followed was even worse. One of the Bosmer trebuchets suddenly turned to Fort Sphinxmoth. The trebuchet fired twice and managed to damage the outer wall. Now, if you recall the orders from the Imperial city, this actually constituted an attack on Imperial forces, so the legions finally formed up to attack the Bosmer. When the Bosmer saw this, they decided to abandon their trebuchets, they started fleeing across the border, and the Legion kept pursuing them for a bit. But this was a mistake. This whole thing was actually just another devious Khajiiti trick. Because it was the Khajiit who actually fired from one of the Bosmer trebuchets. They had managed to take it over with a small group and turned it toward the Legion to draw the soldiers out and make sure that they would pursue the Bosmer. And now with the legions gone, the Khajiit actually took over the fort. Kodesh tells us that some of them levitated over the walls and then goes on to describe how they were helped by Khajiit camps. Quote, "There was a perpetual camp of Khajiit merchants near the fort who sold treats and trinkets, and, in a sign of the decline in moral character of the legion, other services. Even an Ohms is still a Khajiit, and consorting with them should be punished with branding and expulsion, the same as horse lovers, to the soldiers and staff. The camp was only a few tents, but elite Khajiiti forces had been arriving for weeks, and each tent hid a dozen armed Khajiit and at least one wizard." End quote. The situation was even worse because most of the Legion soldiers left at the garrison were actually Khajiit or Bosmer themselves. You see, the Imperial commander decided to leave most of these soldiers at the fort precisely because they couldn't really be relied upon in the heat of battle to stay on the side of the Empire. He was afraid that they would switch allegiance in the midst of a battle, but now they were the only ones guarding the fort, and this was an enormous mistake. As soon as the Khajiit levitated over the walls, the Khajiit Imperial soldiers suddenly turned on their Bosmer fellows and slayed every one of them. They then proceeded to open the gates, and the takeover of Fort Sphinxmoth was complete. When the Legion force returned, it was completely surrounded, and they just had to surrender to the Khajiit. Kodesh concludes the 4th volume of his series with this moving quote. "Given the unreliable nature of the elves and beast races, I strongly recommend that these races not be assigned to any fort in or bordering their traditional lands. Even the Khajiit can serve honorably in the legions, but they should be assigned to forts in Morrowind, High Rock, Skyrim, or at the very heart of the Empire, where the temptation for betrayal is not too strong for their weak character. This is the true story of the fall of Fort Sphinxmoth. It was not conquered in a pitched battle that every Khajiit these days claims to have led. The legions were not defeated. We were betrayed." Now here, we're going to take another break from the Mixed Unit Tactics series to talk about the Khajiit unarmed fighting styles. I'm doing this because the 5th volume of Mixed Unit Tactics will actually be based more around one-to-one combat, and I feel like this is a good spot to talk about the way individual Khajiit fight, just to sort of round off this picture of Khajiit warfare, to sort of give a complete overview of it. But to talk about the Khajiit unarmed fighting styles, we have to bring in some other sources. Our first source will be interview with 3 booksellers. This is an out-of-game lore text that was released before Morrowind, believe it or not. And one of the characters in this text is Jobasha, who is of course the Khajiit bookseller that you meet as part of Morrowind's main quest even. He is asked a question about the Khajiit fighting styles and responds to it. Question: Goutfang, Whispering Claw, and Rolith Kaj, what are those? Jobasha replies, quote, "They are among the many Khajiiti arts of claw and tail. Jobasha learned Rolith Kaj before traveling to Vardenfell. The name means rain of sand, and the art has many styles such as rain, sand, wind, sun, storm, and 2 moons dance." End quote. The Rain of Sand style is also mentioned by various characters in Morrowind, for example as part of the explanation of what a monk does, or during Anasi's dialogue when Anasi says, quote, "In body, Anasi is a student of the ancient martial arts, the Rain of Sand style of home. When Anasi must defend herself, Anasi prefers claw and claws and wears no armor, because what Anasi does not have, Anasi cannot lose." End quote. Now, the Rain of Sand technique actually seems to be the inspiration for most Tamrielic unarmed fighting styles. It seems like the other cultures, other races, have been inspired by this Khajiit fighting style and adopted its techniques. We also mentioned 2 Moons Dance, which we learn more about in the book Master Zoarim's Tale. It tells us of the Temple of 2 Moons Dance situated in Torval, which is apparently the most prestigious fighting ground of the hand-to-hand styles in all of Tamriel. At this dojo, students of all races learn from the sage masters not just combat, but also training of the mind according to revelations of Redel Thar, which is of course just another name for Two Moons Dance. The book Prayers of Baranat, a traditional myth, tells us more of Gautfang. It describes it as an arrhythmic style, which requires balance, coordination, speed, strength, and timing. There is apparently also a style called Whispering Fang, which we don't hear about in Morrowind. We learn about it in The Elder Scrolls V, actually. One of the Skyrim characters mentions it at one point, but doesn't really give us any further details. Now, just for the sake of completeness, I should say that the Khajiit unarmed styles get expanded upon a lot in ESO, where they are also called claw dances, but since I'm frankly just not interested in the lore of ESO, I'll leave it here and not go any deeper into this topic. Instead, let's pick back up with Mixed Unit Tactics Volume 5. Codus tells us that after the surrender of the Legion to the Khajiit, he spent 2 years in Dune as a slave. He would work to forge weapons, repair the city walls, build the local sewage system, and perform other menial tasks. Apparently, the Khajiit treated their slaves pretty well as long as they were obedient and worked. This is what he tells us, quote, "We were well fed and only beaten when one of us tried to escape, attacked the Khajiit, or refused to work. The Khajiit even provided healing, from a half dozen of the most pompous, self-important Alfik I have ever met, when the Red Death ran through our camp. The most galling experience was the behavior of the former legionnaire Jaduzar, now calling himself Droduzar, who strutted around the prison when he was in town, usually with a female of his race on each arm." End quote. The Khajiit allegedly offered to ransom the prisoners to the Imperial City, but they got no response back. Nobody seems to have cared because this was, after all, during a time when the Imperial City was quite corrupt from the simulacrum. Now, as a slave, Codus didn't really get to witness the rest of the battles that took place near Dune with his own two eyes, so here he has to rely on other sources himself. His sources told him that the Bosmer tried to get into the city by digging tunnels underneath the walls. The Khajiit, however, didn't take these efforts seriously. Listen to this, quote, "The Khajiit mocked these efforts and often played pranks, such as filling the tunnel exits with stink bulbs, rotten eggs, sholath, stinging insects, and so on. Sometimes we'd hear muffled screams while working on the sewers or rebuilding the walls. The Khajiit nearby would all burst into laughter at this and plan what to do next. Why they never tried to seal the tunnels or took them seriously as a threat, I cannot understand." End quote. Anyway, these Bosmer efforts were pretty much fruitless because at this point Dune was very well protected. There were Khajiit forces all along the Xylo, left over from early in the war, and the Bosmer weren't really capable of getting an army there. Into the city, I mean. So they instead decided to send a force of just 20 mer to present an open challenge. A duel. Codus was allowed and actually encouraged to watch the duel, apparently to see what the fate of the Empire would be like. The next quote is a bit lengthier but perfect for setting the atmosphere for this duel. Quote, "There was some negotiation, mostly in Taagra, and I could not understand it. Soon a large Khajiit approached, a Palmar Rat in ceremonial armor of his own. The Khajiit called him Drozaksa, and clearly held him in high regard. There was a celebratory feel to the crowd, and the Khajiit thought that they were about to witness an easy victory. I was more apprehensive. The Bosmer Knight was very brave, or foolish, and showed no fear of the upcoming duel. The negotiations were completed. I gathered that the Bosmer would take Dune and Fort Sphinxmoth if they won, and the Khajiit would take a living hill if they won. A space was made for the combatants. Drozaksa was armed only with ebony claw tips and wore heavy, for lack of a better word, barding. He was well protected from the front and the front half of his sides, but he was unarmored on his paws, head, and hind legs. The Knight of the Spiderwood drew a very thin blade, barely even a rapier, and was covered head to toe with light armor made of wooden slats and some kind of fabric." End quote. The fighters began the duel by circling each other, and afterwards they clashed several times. It was immediately obvious that the Bosmer's rapier could not hope to pierce the Khajiit's armor, and in fact the Khajiit managed to break the blade almost immediately. The Khajiit was sure of his victory, so he kept attacking, but the Bosmer managed to dodge everything, showing high acrobatic skills. The Khajiit was slowly getting tired. At one point he actually cut himself on the sword he'd broken, that the Bosmer was still holding. Eventually the Khajiit managed to land a strike and scar the Bosmer's armor, but what happened next was stunning. Quote, "Soon the Bosmer was almost strolling around the arena as Drozaxa stumbled and slipped in his own blood. Treacherous to the end, the Khajiit almost managed to swipe at the Bosmer by pretending to be weaker than he actually was, but after that the outcome was certain. The bleeding poison," Droduzar said next to me. "Clever." The Bosmer knight removed her helmet and gave the crowd a creepy wolfish smile and began, to put it bluntly, butchering the Palmar with her broken sword. The few Bosmer who accompanied her cheered. End quote. That's right, the Bosmer actually won the duel, and against all expectations, the Khajiit actually honored the deal. Kodos was surprised to watch as they packed up and simply left the city, and the Bosmer were then able to take Dune and Fort Sphinxmoth. After they had done so, they released all the prisoners, and then Valenwood actually surrounded to elsewhere. This might seem strange in light of the recent victory, but we have to consider the broader circumstances of the war, which frankly we just don't know enough about. We are aware that the Valenwood was also fighting another war in the west, so presumably they just wanted to get this over with, and they used this victory to gain a much better position in the negotiations. The city of Dune ended up being returned to the Khajiit and exchanged for some territory in the south. After the end of the imperial simulacrum, both rebellious provinces actually returned to the empire, and Fort Sphinxmoth was reinstated as an imperial fort. Now, we don't know what Kodos Kalonus was doing after that. What we do know is that he ended up in Aldrun as a popular bookseller. So, if you ever find yourself in Aldrun, make sure to visit the old veteran, ask him about his experiences in the war, and treat him with respect. I thank you very much for listening to this podcast. I hope you learned a lot about the military strategy in Tamriel. I think this topic was honestly just fascinating. I hope I did it justice, at least to some extent. And honestly, I would love to see more similar books, more books which talk about the military strategy of various races, various cultures. So if there are any other fascinating accounts to study, particularly of a military nature, but just any lore books in general that you would like me to cover in this format, please let me know. Again, thank you for listening. Have a great day, and Alm Civi bless.